triangle because we all know each other so well. Yeah. And so to be able to work together on something that is...
They were the couple everyone believed in. The ones who made love look possible even after everything had gone wrong before. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, together for 19 years, survived what most Hollywood marriages couldn't. But in the spring of 2025, something shifted. Keith quietly stopped coming home. Nicole, exhausted and finally willing to face what she'd been avoiding for years, filed for divorce. The world was stunned. They'd seemed unshakable. But those closest to Nicole knew the truth. She'd been holding this marriage together alone for longer than anyone realized, and the weight of it had finally become too much to carry. When they first met in 2005 at a Los Angeles event, neither particularly wanted to attend. Nicole and Keith were both carrying wounds they hadn't yet learned how to heal. Nicole was still reeling from her divorce from Tom Cruise, still trying to make sense of the years she'd lost, trying to fit into his world, still grieving the distance that had grown between her and the 2 children she'd adopted during that marriage. The pain of that separation was something she rarely spoke about publicly, but it lived inside her like a constant ache. Keith, meanwhile, was drowning in his own chaos. He was touring relentlessly, using music as a shield against the depression that haunted him off stage, numbing himself with alcohol and substances that promised temporary relief from the loneliness he couldn't escape. When they saw each other across that crowded room, something clicked. She saw in him a vulnerability that felt familiar, a brokenness that mirrored her own. He saw in her a grace and strength that made him believe he could become someone better. They fell into each other quickly, desperately. 2 people convinced they could save one another from the wreckage of their pasts. Their wedding in June 2006 was the kind of event that made people believe in second chances. It was held in Sydney, intimate and romantic, with lanterns glowing against the evening sky and Nicole barefoot in white lace, her face radiant with hope. Keith wept as he spoke his vows, promising her forever, promising her safety, promising her the family she'd been longing for. The photographs were beautiful. The world exhaled in relief. But the fairy tale began to crack almost immediately. Just 4 months after they exchanged rings, Keith checked himself into rehab. The news was public, the shame private. Nicole stood by him, issuing careful statements about love and commitment, visiting him when her filming schedule allowed, determined not to lose another family, not to fail again at making a marriage work. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The realization settled in quietly, painfully. Love, no matter how cinematic or genuine, couldn't rewrite the patterns already carved into their bones. The years that followed were a study in controlled chaos. To the outside world, they seemed to be thriving. Keith emerged from treatment with gratitude pouring from every interview, crediting Nicole with saving his life, calling her his anchor, his reason for getting clean. They had 2 daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, arrivals that softened their public image and gave them something beyond themselves to protect. The red carpet photographs multiplied, endless images of Keith's hand on Nicole's back, her head tilted toward him in what looked like adoration, the 4 of them together looking like the picture of Hollywood redemption. But inside their homes, anxiety hummed constantly. Nicole lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, watching for signs of relapse, terrified that one wrong move would send him spiraling back into the darkness. Keith felt suffocated by her watchfulness, by the unspoken pressure to stay fixed, to be the man she needed him to be rather than whoever he actually was. His touring schedule became a refuge, months on the road where he could breathe without feeling monitored. Her film career kept her traveling too, 16-hour days becoming other people, pouring herself into characters because it was easier than facing what was missing in her real life. They coordinated their schedules around the children, around logistics and appearances, but rarely around each other. The intimacy that had once felt urgent and necessary slowly calcified into polite routine. Their marriage became a performance they were both too tired to maintain, but too afraid to abandon. In public, they were flawless. Keith would serenade Nicole at award shows, his voice breaking with emotion as he sang about loving her. She would gaze at him with what cameras interpreted as devotion, her hand reaching for his, their bodies fitting together in ways that looked natural and easy. But at home, they moved around each other like strangers sharing space, conversations limited to scheduling and superficial pleasantries, the hard truths left unspoken because speaking them would require admitting how far they'd drifted. Nicole wanted stability, wanted family dinners and shared routines, wanted Keith to choose home over the constant pull of the road. Keith felt trapped by domesticity, by the weight of her expectations, by the fear that if he stayed still too long, he'd have to face everything he'd been running from. Their daughters became the glue holding them together. The reason to keep trying, even when trying, felt impossible. Nicole threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything, determined to give Sunday and Faith the childhood she couldn't give Connor and Bella, determined not to lose another set of children to divorce. Keith loved his daughters fiercely, but remained emotionally distant, present physically but unreachable in the ways that mattered most. By 2023, the distance between them was no longer something they could hide even from themselves. Keith spent more time in Nashville than Los Angeles, his reasons always tied to work, always justifiable on paper but hollow in practice. Nicole flew back and forth with the girls, maintaining the illusion of family unity for school events and holidays. But the coldness had set in deep. They barely touched anymore. They spoke in logistics and avoided conflict because conflict would require honesty, and honesty would break whatever fragile thing they were still clinging to. Friends noticed the shift, the way they arrived separately at events, the careful politeness that replaced the easy affection they'd once shared. Rumors began circulating quietly that they were living separate lives, that the marriage had become more legal arrangement than partnership. Nicole held on because she didn't know how to do anything else, because admitting failure felt like admitting she was fundamentally unlovable, because she'd already lost one family and couldn't bear to lose another. The breaking point came in 2024, when Nicole was filming Practical Magic 2 in a remote location, and Keith simply stopped coming home. There was no dramatic fight, no ultimatum, no moment of clarity. He just stopped returning in the ways she'd come to expect. His absence was quiet, but absolute. A door closing without sound. Nicole felt it immediately, that sickening certainty that something irreversible had shifted. She called. He texted back with brief, distant responses. The conversations were polite and empty, devoid of the intimacy that should exist between people who'd shared nearly 20 years of life. Rumors began spreading. Whispers about Keith being seen with someone else, about him moving on emotionally even if the paperwork hadn't caught up. Nicole waited for an explanation that never came. She kept working, kept smiling for cameras, kept her silence because her daughters were watching, and she refused to let them see her break. But those who knew her saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her entire body seemed to be carrying a weight she was finally ready to set down. When Nicole filed for divorce in September 2025, the details were stark and telling. She requested nearly full custody of their daughters, citing Keith's touring schedule and frequent absences as reasons they needed stability with her. She asked for no spousal support, no division of his touring income, nothing that could be interpreted as vindictiveness. She simply wanted out, wanted to protect her children, wanted to stop pretending. Keith's response came not through lawyers, but through music. During a live performance shortly after the news broke, he changed the lyrics of a song he'd written about her years earlier, replacing words of devotion with something sharper, something that felt like blame. The audience gasped. Social media erupted. He was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough that everyone understood what he was doing. He was rewriting their story publicly, positioning himself as the one who'd been stifled, controlled, pushed away by a woman who demanded too much. Nicole stayed silent, refusing to engage in a public battle, protecting her daughters from the ugliness of watching their parents destroy each other in tabloids. When Nicole finally began to speak her truth, she did so carefully, in fragments that revealed more than full confessions ever could. In a Vogue interview months after filing, she said quietly, "You think you know your path. You think you know who you're walking it with. And then one day you realize you've been walking alone for a long time without admitting it." Friends spoke more directly, painting a picture of a woman who'd loved someone so completely that she'd lost herself in the process, who'd begged for therapy and communication and been met with avoidance, who'd only realized Keith had left long before he physically moved out. Some close to Nicole revealed that she'd recognized phrases in his recent songs, lines taken directly from private arguments they'd had, intimate moments weaponized and repackaged as art. The betrayal of that cut deeper than the divorce itself. The realization that while she'd been protecting their privacy, he'd been mining their pain for content. Now Nicole moves through her life with a different kind of strength, the quiet dignity of someone who's survived what she thought would destroy her. The divorce is not an ending, but a reclamation, an act of survival and self-preservation. It's her second broken family, her second public failure at forever. But this time she stands differently. She knows now that staying wasn't strength but fear, that protecting her daughters means teaching them that walking away from what diminishes you is not giving up, but growing up. She doesn't speak bitterly about Keith, doesn't play the victim the world expects. She simply exists more fully as herself, softer and harder simultaneously, learning that love doesn't require martyrdom. Keith continues touring, filling stadiums, singing songs, surrounded by people who'll never ask the hard questions, and somewhere in the silence between what was and what comes next, there remains an unanswered question that only time will reveal. Will Keith Urban ever truly understand what he walked away from? Or will he spend the rest of his life running from the truth that the family he lost was the one thing worth staying still for?